Welcome to Drowsworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the Black Death of 1347, a disaster so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about why medieval medicine thought bad smells could literally kill you. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Feel free to turn the lights down low, maybe put a fan on for that gentle hum. Get comfortable, because we're about to journey back to one of humanity's darkest hours, when half of Europe simply vanished into history's most terrifying pandemic. Why you wouldn't last a day during the Black Death. Imagine waking up in October 1347, in the bustling port city of Genoa. The Mediterranean sun filters through your small wooden shutters, and for a moment, everything seems normal. But then you remember, the ships arrived yesterday. Those strange, silent vessels from the east, drifting into harbor like ghost ships. The few crew members still alive spoke of cities emptied, of death following their wake across the known world. You pull your rough woolen blanket closer and step outside into what would become humanity's greatest nightmare. The year is 1347, and you are about to witness the arrival of Yersinia Pestis, though you won't know that name. To you, this will be the great mortality, the pestilence, the wrath of God made manifest. Modern historians call it the Black Death, and it's about to kill between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's population. But statistics can't capture what it would actually feel like to live through this catastrophe, to wake up each morning wondering if you'll see another sunset. Let's start with your morning routine, because even during the apocalypse, life has to go on, at least for a while. You're a merchant, moderately successful, living in a 2-story house near Genoa's harbor. You've heard whispers about the sickness in the east, but surely it won't reach your prosperous Italian city-state. After all, you live in one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. You have universities, hospitals, and the best physicians money can buy. Your first mistake is stepping outside. The morning air, which yesterday smelled of sea salt and fresh bread from the baker's ovens, now carries something else. Something sweet and cloying that you can't quite identify. It's the smell of death, though you don't realize it yet. Bodies are already beginning to pile up in the poorer quarters of the city, and the medieval practice of throwing waste into the streets means that disease can spread with terrifying efficiency. You make your way to the market, and immediately notice something's wrong. Where yesterday there were dozens of vendors hawking everything from spices to fine cloth, today only half the stalls are occupied. Several merchants are absent, and their neighbors whisper about sudden illnesses, about people who went to bed healthy and woke up dying. You shrugged it off. People get sick. It's part of life. But then you see your first victim. A woman collapses near the fish market, her body convulsing as black. Blood-filled buboes, the size of apples, swell in her neck and armpits. These swellings, called buboes, give the bubonic plague its name, and they're filled with infected lymph nodes desperately trying to fight an infection they can't possibly win. The woman's skin has taken on a grayish hue, and dark patches spread across her arms like spilled ink. She's burning with fever, but also shivering uncontrollably. In her delirium, she calls out for water, for her children, for God to take away the pain. A crowd gathers, but nobody helps. By now, even in these early days, people are beginning to understand that getting close to the sick means becoming sick yourself. A priest approaches to give last rites, and you watch as he carefully keeps his distance, muttering Latin prayers while holding a cloth soaked in vinegar over his nose and mouth. The prevailing medical theory of the time holds that disease spreads through miasma, bad air filled with corrupted vapors, so people carry flowers, herbs, and vinegar-soaked rags, believing these sweet smells will protect them from the poisonous atmosphere of pestilence. They're wrong, of course. The plague spreads primarily through flea bites, though it can also transmit through respiratory droplets in its pneumonic form. But you don't know this. Nobody does. The germ theory of disease won't be developed for another 500 years. So you clutch your small pouch of lavender and continue about your business, confident that your precautions will keep you safe. By noon, 3 more people have collapsed in the streets. By evening, the woman from the fish market is dead, her body already beginning to bloat in the Mediterranean heat. The city authorities, overwhelmed and terrified, have started burning bodies in great pits outside the city walls. The smoke from these funeral pyres will become a constant presence on the horizon, a dark column that serves as a daily reminder of the city's mounting death toll. You return home as the sun sets, and that's when you notice the first sign. A small, tender swelling in your armpit, no bigger than a pea. You tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe you slept wrong. Maybe you strained something moving heavy goods at the warehouse. But deep down, in that primal part of your brain that recognizes danger, you know exactly what it is. The incubation period for bubonic plague is typically 2 to 6 days after the infected flea bite. Those fleas came from the rats that lived on the grain ships from the east, ships that have been docking in Genoa's harbor for weeks now. You probably picked up your infection days ago. Maybe from a flea that jumped off a dying rat in your warehouse. Maybe from handling goods that came from an infected ship. The exact moment doesn't matter now. What matters is what happens next. Over the next day, the swelling in your armpit grows rapidly. It becomes painful to move your arm, and the lymph node swells to the size of a chicken egg, then an apple. The skin around it turns black and begins to split open, leaking a mixture of blood and pus that smells like rotting meat. The pain is excruciating, a constant burning, throbbing agony that makes it impossible to sleep. Your temperature spikes to dangerous levels. In an age without thermometers, you only know that you're burning up from the inside, that your skin feels like it's on fire while your teeth chatter uncontrollably from chills. You develop a splitting headache that makes it hard to think clearly, and every sound, every ray of light, feels like a knife stabbing into your skull. The medieval treatments for plague would be almost comical if they weren't so tragic. The local physician, if you're wealthy enough to afford one, might suggest bleeding you to restore the balance of your humors. He'll make cuts in your arms or legs, allowing precious blood to drain away, while your body desperately needs every resource to fight the infection. Alternatively, he might prescribe a mixture of crushed pearls and gold dust, believing that these precious materials can draw out the corruption in your blood. Some physicians recommend holding a live chicken against the buboes, believing the bird will draw out the poison. Others suggest applying heated irons to burn away the infected flesh. A few progressive doctors might lance the buboes to drain the pus, which actually can provide some relief, though it also creates open wounds that can become secondary infection sites in an age without antiseptics. If you're poor, you'll rely on folk remedies passed down through generations. Maybe your neighbor will bring you a poultice made from bread mold, not knowing that centuries later, scientists will discover this actually contains penicillin-producing fungi. More likely, someone will suggest drinking your own urine, applying cow dung to the swellings, or wearing amulets made from toad skin or powdered unicorn horn. The psychological torment might be worse than the physical suffering. Medieval Europe is a deeply religious society, and many people interpret the plague as God's judgment for humanity's sins. Flagellant movements spring up across the continent, with groups of people whipping themselves bloody in public squares, believing their suffering might appease divine wrath and end the pestilence. Others turn to scapegoating, blaming Jews, foreigners, or anyone different for bringing God's curse upon their communities. In your delirium, you begin to hallucinate. The fever has scrambled your brain chemistry, and you see demons dancing in the shadows of your room, hear voices calling your name from empty streets. You might confess to sins you never committed, or imagine that your dead relatives have come to escort you to the afterlife. Your family, if they haven't already fled or died themselves, can only watch helplessly as you thrash in your bed, crying out to invisible tormentors. The plague doesn't just kill individuals, it destroys the entire fabric of society. As more people fall ill, normal life begins to break down. Shops close because their owners are dead. Farmers abandon their fields because there's nobody left to work them. Ships arrive in harbors with entire crews dead, drifting like ghost vessels until they run aground on beaches where their cargo of grain and corpses mixes together in the surf. The death toll rises so rapidly that traditional burial practices become impossible. In Paris, the cemetery of the Holy Innocents becomes so overcrowded that bodies are stacked 5 deep in mass graves. When even these giant pits fill up, workers begin burning corpses in enormous pyres that burn day and night, filling the air with thick, greasy smoke that can be smelled for miles. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to your medieval plague experience. Religious institutions, normally the backbone of medieval society, begin to crumble under the weight of mass death. Monasteries that once housed hundreds of monks are reduced to a handful of survivors. Priests die so quickly that the church grants special dispensations, allowing lay people to hear confessions and give last rites. Some parishes lose their entire clergy, leaving communities without spiritual guidance during humanity's darkest hour. The economic consequences are equally catastrophic. Trade networks that took centuries to develop collapse overnight as cities empty and merchant families die out. The price of labor skyrockets because there simply aren't enough people left to do essential work. In some regions, surviving peasants can demand wages that would have been unthinkable before the plague, leading to the gradual breakdown of the feudal system that had dominated European society for centuries. Your own death, when it finally comes, is neither quick nor peaceful. The plague kills in several ways, and you're unlucky enough to experience the full progression. As your immune system fails completely, secondary infections take hold in your weakened body. Pneumonia fills your lungs with fluid, making each breath a struggle. Septicemia, blood poisoning, causes your organs to shut down one by one. Your heart, working overtime to fight infections it can't overcome, begins to fail. In your final hours, you develop the pneumonic form of plague, which affects your lungs and makes you highly contagious through airborne droplets. Every cough, every labored breath, releases millions of bacteria into the air around your bed. If anyone is brave enough to tend to you, they're likely signing their own death warrant. The pneumonic plague is almost universally fatal and can kill within 24 hours of symptom onset. Your last coherent thought might be wonder at how quickly everything fell apart. A month ago, your biggest worry was whether the grain shipment from Sicily would arrive on time. You had plans, dreams, maybe a business deal that would secure your family's fortune for generations. Now your city is half empty, your trade partners are dead, and your own family faces the choice between staying to mourn you or fleeing while they still can. the Black Death doesn't just kill you. It erases entire ways of life that had existed for centuries. Art styles disappear because the artists die before they can pass on their techniques. Recipes are lost because grandmothers die before teaching them to their granddaughters. Entire bloodlines vanish, taking with them oral histories, family traditions, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Yet somehow, humanity survives. The plague burns itself out, partly because it kills its hosts too quickly to sustain widespread transmission, and partly because the surviving population develops some immunity. Cities slowly repopulate, though it takes generations for the population to return to pre-plague levels. New artistic movements emerge from the trauma, including the Danse Macabre tradition that reminds people of death's universality. The survivors who lived through the Black Death created a world that was fundamentally different from the one that existed before. 1347. Labor shortages led to increased wages for common workers. The breakdown of feudal structures accelerated the development of more modern economic systems. The massive death toll even had environmental benefits, as abandoned farmland returned to forest and wildlife populations recovered. But none of this matters to you. Lying in your medieval bed, burning with fever and covered in oozing buboes. You wouldn't survive because you couldn't survive. The medical knowledge necessary to treat bacterial infections wouldn't exist for another 6 centuries. The sanitation systems needed to prevent the spread of disease were beyond medieval technology. Even the basic understanding of how diseases spread remained a mystery that wouldn't be solved until the development of germ theory in the 1800s. As night falls on your final day, the sounds of the city you once knew have changed completely. Instead of the cheerful noise of merchants hawking their wares and children playing in the streets, you hear the constant tolling of church bells marking the dead, the creaking wheels of carts collecting corpses, and the distant sound of flames from the burning pits where your neighbors' bodies fuel the night sky. This is why you wouldn't survive the Black Death of 1347. Not because you were weak or unprepared, but because you were human, living in a world where humanity had not yet developed the tools necessary to fight microscopic enemies. Your death would be one of tens of millions, a number so large it defies comprehension, representing not just individual tragedy but the near collapse of European civilization itself. In your final delirium, you might witness scenes that would haunt any survivor lucky enough to escape your fate. Through your fever-clouded vision, you see your neighbors making impossible choices. A mother deciding whether to flee with her healthy children or stay with her plague-stricken husband. A merchant burning his own warehouse rather than let infected goods spread the disease further. A priest giving last rites to an entire family, knowing he'll likely join them within days. The social fabric unravels in ways that medieval society was never designed to handle. Marriage contracts become meaningless when entire wedding parties die before the ceremony. Apprenticeships end abruptly when master craftsmen succumb, taking centuries of specialized knowledge to their graves. Legal disputes pile up in courts where the judges, lawyers, and witnesses have all perished, leaving property ownership in chaos that will take generations to resolve. Even the dead cannot rest in peace. Traditional burial rites, so crucial to medieval Catholic beliefs about the afterlife, become impossible to maintain. Bodies are buried without proper consecration, sometimes in unconsecrated ground, violating religious laws that families died trying to uphold. The living face an impossible choice between honoring their dead and protecting themselves from infection. Many choose survival, carrying guilt that will poison whatever years remain to them. Your own body becomes a battlefield where medieval understanding of medicine proves utterly inadequate. The four humors theory, which dominated medical thinking for over 1,000 years, suggests that disease results from an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians might try to restore balance by making you vomit, inducing diarrhea, or bloodletting. Treatments that only weaken your body's ability to fight the actual bacterial infection ravaging your lymphatic system. Some doctors prescribe theriac, a supposed universal antidote containing dozens of ingredients, including vipers, flesh, opium, and ground pearls. This expensive concoction, even if you could afford it, does nothing against Yersinia pestis. Others recommend astrological timing for treatments, believing that celestial alignments influence the body's ability to heal. They might delay essential care, waiting for Mercury to enter the proper house, or Jupiter to achieve the correct aspect with Mars. The psychological torment extends beyond personal suffering to existential crises. Medieval Europeans believed in a divinely ordered universe where everything happened according to God's plan. The plagues, seemingly random destruction, challenges this worldview at its core. Why do some die while others live? Why do the pious perish while sinners sometimes survive? Why would a loving God permit such wholesale slaughter of his creation? These theological questions produce responses ranging from increased religious devotion to complete abandonment of faith. Some communities organize massive prayer vigils, believing collective penance might end the catastrophe. Others turn to hedonism, reasoning that if death is inevitable, they might as well enjoy their final days. The result is a society torn between extreme religiosity and desperate debauchery, often existing side by side in the same communities. Your death will contribute to a demographic catastrophe that reshapes European society for centuries. Entire villages disappear, their names surviving only in old tax records and parish registers. Monasteries that preserved classical learning through the Dark Ages lose their libraries to fire, flood, or simple neglect, when there's nobody left to maintain them. Trade routes that connected distant cultures break down, isolating regions that had enjoyed centuries of cultural exchange. The agricultural consequences prove equally devastating. Farms abandoned mid-harvest create food shortages that compound the plague's direct effects. Livestock, left untended, either starve or revert to wild populations that damage crops and spread disease. Irrigation systems, carefully maintained for generations, break down without skilled workers to repair them, turning productive farmland into swamp or desert. Yet your individual death, horrible as it is, represents just one thread in a tapestry of transformation that will ultimately lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern world. The plague's destruction of traditional authorities creates space for new ideas, new art forms, and new ways of organizing society. The labor shortage will empower common workers. The breakdown of feudalism will pave the way for capitalism, and the questioning of traditional medicine will eventually lead to scientific revolution. But none of these future benefits can comfort you as consciousness fades and your body finally surrenders to an enemy too small to see but too powerful to resist. Your last sensation might be the sound of rain on your roof, a gentle patter that will continue long after you're gone, washing clean a world forever changed by humanity's encounter with the Black Death. The plague changed everything, from art to economics to social structure, leaving scars on human culture that are still visible today. But that's a story for another segment of our journey through this medieval nightmare. The witness who survived to tell the tales. While millions perished in the darkness of 1347 to 1351, one man not only survived, but created one of history's most vivid accounts of humanity's greatest catastrophe. His name was Giovanni Boccaccio, and his experience during the Black Death would transform him from a minor Italian, writer into one of literature's most important chroniclers of human suffering and resilience. Born in 1313, probably in Florence, though some claim Paris, Boccaccio was the illegitimate son of a Florentine merchant. By the time the plague reached Italy in 1347, he was 34 years old, already established as a writer but far from the literary giant he would become. He had spent his youth in Naples, immersed in the sophisticated court culture of King Robert of Anjou, where he wrote romantic poetry and fell in love with a mysterious woman he called Fiammetta, who would inspire much of his early work. But romance and courtly literature seemed frivolous when death began stalking the streets of Florence in the spring of 1348. Boccaccio found himself witness to scenes that would haunt literature for centuries to come. Unlike the millions who died anonymously, he possessed the rare combination of literary skill, social position, and sheer luck that allowed him to document what he saw and live to share it with future generations. Florence in 1348 was one of Europe's greatest cities, a center of banking, trade, and culture with perhaps 100,000 inhabitants. The city had survived political upheavals, foreign invasions, and economic crises, but nothing had prepared it for the arrival of Yersinia pestis. The plague likely reached Florence through Pisa's port, carried by Genoese ships fleeing their own infected harbors. Within months, Florence would lose between 1/3 and half of its population. Boccaccio watched his city transform into a charnel house. The Arno River, which had carried trade goods and fresh water into the heart of Florence, became clogged with corpses thrown from bridges by desperate families who couldn't afford proper burials. The magnificent churches where Dante had worshipped and Giotto had painted became makeshift morgues, their sacred spaces defiled by the practical necessities of mass death. As a member of Florence's educated merchant class, Boccaccio had access to areas of the city that common people couldn't enter. He witnessed the plague's impact on every level of society, from the magnificent palaces of banking families to the crowded tenements where the poor died in stacks. His social connections allowed him to observe how different classes responded to the catastrophe, material that would later inform his masterwork. The death tally in Florence reached staggering proportions. Contemporary accounts, including Boccaccio's own, suggest that on some days the city buried over 1,000 people. The traditional funeral rites that had structured medieval life for centuries became impossible to maintain. Instead of individual ceremonies with proper mourning periods, bodies were collected in carts like garbage, blessed quickly by overwhelmed priests, and buried in mass graves outside the city walls. Boccaccio documented the complete breakdown of social norms that accompanied the plague's arrival. Families abandoned their sick relatives, fleeing to the countryside in hopes of escaping infection. Servants deserted their masters, regardless of years of loyalty or financial obligation. Even priests, the supposed shepherds of their flocks, fled their parishes rather than risk infection by administering last rites to the dying. The young writer found himself caught between two equally dangerous choices. He could remain in Florence, where death stalked every street and building, or he could flee to the countryside, where bandits and desperate refugees made travel extremely hazardous. Many of Florence's elite chose flight, abandoning their palaces and businesses to seek safety in rural villas. Others barricaded themselves in their homes, hoping that isolation might protect them from the airborne miasma they believed carried the disease. Boccaccio chose a third option that would prove crucial for literary history. He gathered with a group of friends in a villa outside Florence, creating a small community of survivors who entertained each other with stories while the plague raged around them. This real-life experience would later become the framing device for his masterpiece, the Decameron, where 10 young people flee plague-stricken Florence and spend 10 days telling each other 100 stories. But the reality was far grimmer than the literary version would suggest. Even in their countryside retreat, death remained a constant presence. Refugees passed their villa daily, many already showing signs of infection. Local peasants died in their fields, leaving crops to rot while their families fled or perished. The social order that had maintained rural life for centuries collapsed as quickly as it had in the cities. During this period of isolation, Boccaccio began collecting the stories and observations that would make him famous. He interviewed survivors, recorded eyewitness accounts, and documented the various ways different people responded to the catastrophe. Some turned to religious extremism, joining flagellant movements that whipped themselves bloody in public squares. Others embraced hedonism, reasoning that if death was inevitable, they might as well enjoy their final days. Perhaps most fascinating to Boccaccio were the stories of individual heroism and cowardice that the plague revealed. He wrote about physicians who continued treating patients despite knowing they faced almost certain death. He documented mothers who nursed plague victims back to health through sheer determination and folk remedies. Conversely, he recorded instances of shocking selfishness, including healthy people who murdered sick family members to prevent infection from spreading. The plague also created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility. With traditional authority structures collapsed, clever survivors could claim abandoned property, assume false identities, or establish themselves in occupations previously closed to their social class. Boccaccio observed servants becoming masters overnight when their employers died, and peasants moving into noble palaces left empty by deceased families. Leave us a comment about what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or just check in and let us know how you're doing. You're an important part of our little corner of the internet, and we love hearing from you. These dramatic reversals of fortune fascinated Boccaccio because they revealed the arbitrary nature of social hierarchy. Birth, wealth, and education proved meaningless when faced with bacterial infection. The plague was remarkably democratic in its selection of victims, killing kings and beggars with equal efficiency. This observation would profoundly influence Boccaccio's later writing, which often featured characters from different social classes interacting as equals. As the plague gradually burned itself out in Florence during 1349, Boccaccio returned to a city transformed beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, their buildings already beginning to decay without inhabitants to maintain them. The sophisticated commercial networks that had made Florence wealthy lay in ruins, with many trading partners dead and others too impoverished to conduct business. The psychological impact on survivors proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Many experienced what modern psychologists would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though medieval medicine had no understanding of mental health conditions. Survivors reported persistent nightmares, inability to form new relationships, and paralyzing fear of enclosed spaces or crowds. Some became obsessed with death, spending their remaining years preparing elaborate tombs or joining religious orders focused on mortality. Boccaccio himself struggled with survivor's guilt that would influence his writing for decades. He had witnessed the deaths of friends, colleagues, and family members, while somehow escaping infection himself. This experience gave his later work a profound awareness of life's fragility and the randomness of fate. His characters often face sudden reversals of fortune that mirror his own experience during the plague years. The economic consequences of the plague also shaped Boccaccio's worldview. Florence's population decline created severe labor shortages, which allowed surviving workers to demand higher wages and better working conditions. The traditional feudal relationships between masters and servants broke down as desperate employers competed for scarce workers. These changes accelerated the development of more modern economic relationships based on contracts rather than hereditary obligations. Boccaccio documented these transformations with the eye of a social historian. He observed how plague survivors often abandoned traditional occupations to pursue opportunities that had been closed to them before the demographic catastrophe. Farmers became merchants, servants became artisans, and women assumed economic roles previously reserved for men. The result was a more fluid, dynamic society that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance flowering of art and culture. The religious implications of the plague deeply troubled Boccaccio, who had been raised in medieval Christianity's certainties about divine justice and cosmic order. The seemingly random nature of plague deaths challenged fundamental beliefs about God's relationship with humanity. Why did pious monks die while sinful merchants survived? Why did innocent children perish while corrupt officials escaped infection? These theological questions produced a crisis of faith that affected not just Boccaccio, but entire communities of survivors. Some responded by becoming more devoutly religious, interpreting their survival as evidence of divine favor. Others abandoned Christianity entirely, embracing philosophical skepticism or returning to pre-Christian beliefs. Many, like Boccaccio himself, developed a more complex, nuanced relationship with traditional religious teachings. The literary revolution that emerged from this spiritual crisis would transform European culture. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the years immediately following the plague, featured stories that questioned religious authority, celebrated human sexuality, and portrayed clergy as often corrupt and hypocritical. This represented a dramatic departure from medieval literature's typical reverence for church teachings. By the time Boccaccio completed the Decameron around 1353, he had transformed his plague experience into something approaching art. The work's frame narrative, featuring 10 young people fleeing pestilence, allowed him to explore themes of mortality, social change, and human resilience through the vehicle of entertaining stories. The 100 tales told by his characters ranged from bawdy comedies to tragic romances, but all reflected the plague's impact on Italian society. The success of the Decameron established Boccaccio as one of Europe's most important writers, alongside his contemporary Petrarch and their shared inspiration, Dante. But more importantly, it preserved for future generations a vivid account of how ordinary people responded to extraordinary catastrophe. Without Boccaccio's witness testimony, our understanding of the Black Death's human impact would be far more limited. Boccaccio lived until 1375, nearly 3 decades after the plague's initial devastation. During those years, he continued writing and became an important figure in the early Renaissance humanist movement. He helped establish the scholarly study of classical literature and contributed to the rediscovery of ancient texts that had been neglected during the medieval period. But his greatest contribution remained his chronicle of the Black Death years. Through his eyes, we can understand not just the statistics of mortality, but the actual experience of living through civilization's near collapse. His account reveals how quickly social norms can disintegrate, how individuals respond to existential crisis, and how survivors rebuild their lives from catastrophe's ruins. Boccaccio's story reminds us that even history's darkest moments produce witnesses who preserve the memory of both horror and heroism. His survival allowed him to document an experience that killed most of its other potential chroniclers. In doing so, he created a bridge between the medieval world that died with the plague and the Renaissance world that emerged from its ashes. During his final decades, Boccaccio became increasingly interested in preserving the knowledge that had nearly been lost during the plague years. He recognized that when scholars, scribes, and teachers died en masse, entire intellectual traditions could vanish overnight. This realization drove him to collect manuscripts, transcribe classical texts, and establish relationships with other surviving scholars across Europe. His correspondence from this period reveals a man haunted by what he had witnessed, but determined to ensure that future generations would understand both the horror and the lessons of the plague years. He wrote extensively about the social changes he had observed, documenting how the massive death toll had inadvertently created opportunities for women, peasants, and other marginalized groups to assume roles previously denied to them. One of Boccaccio's most fascinating observations concerned the emergence of new forms of art and literature from the plague's devastation. He noticed that survivors often expressed their experiences through increasingly realistic, emotionally raw, creative works. The idealized courtly romances that had dominated pre-plague literature gave way to grittier, more psychologically complex narratives that reflected the trauma and disillusionment of the post-plague world. This artistic evolution wasn't limited to literature. Boccaccio documented how painters began incorporating more realistic depictions of death, suffering, and human emotion into their religious works. The elegant, stylized figures of medieval art gradually gave way to the more naturalistic style that would characterize Renaissance painting. He understood that he was witnessing not just demographic change, but cultural transformation on an unprecedented scale. The plague had also created a generation gap that fascinated Boccaccio. Those who had lived through the catastrophe carried psychological scars that younger people, born after the plague's end, could barely comprehend. This created tensions within families and communities as survivors struggled to explain experiences that defied normal understanding. Children born in the 1350s grew up in a world shaped by catastrophe, but had no personal memory of the stability that had preceded it. Boccaccio became particularly interested in how different regions had responded to the plague's challenge. Through his extensive correspondence with other writers and scholars, he collected accounts from across Europe, creating an informal network of plague chroniclers. He learned that while the basic pattern of devastation remained consistent, local responses varied dramatically based on cultural, political, and geographic factors. In some German cities, the plague had triggered violent pogroms against Jewish communities, blamed for somehow causing the pestilence through well poisoning or other supposed conspiracies. In parts of France, flagellant movements had taken over entire towns, with residents whipping themselves bloody in public squares while chanting prayers for divine mercy. In England, the labour shortages had triggered peasant revolts that challenged the fundamental structures of feudalism. These varied responses convinced Boccaccio that the plague's impact extended far beyond simple mortality statistics. It had revealed deep cultural fault lines and accelerated social changes that might otherwise have taken centuries to develop. He began to see the Black Death, not just as a medical catastrophe, but as a catalyst that had compressed historical evolution into a few brutal years. His later works increasingly reflected this understanding of the plague as a transformative historical force. He wrote about characters who embodied the social mobility that mass death had made possible, about communities struggling to rebuild their cultural traditions after losing most of their elders, and about individuals grappling with philosophical questions that the plague had made unavoidable. Boccaccio's health, perhaps weakened by his plague experience, began declining in his 60s. He suffered from what contemporary sources describe as dropsy, possibly heart failure or kidney disease. As death approached, he spent increasing time revising and expanding his plague writings. determined to leave behind as complete a record as possible of what he had witnessed. His final letters reveal a man at peace with his mortality, but anxious about the preservation of historical memory. He worried that future generations might sanitize or romanticize the plague years, losing sight of both the horror and the human capacity for adaptation that the catastrophe had revealed. He urged younger scholars to continue collecting survivor testimonies, while witnesses remained alive. When Boccaccio died in December 1375, he left behind not just literary masterpieces, but a comprehensive archive of plague-era documents, letters, and testimonies. His house in Certaldo became a repository of memory, preserving voices that would otherwise have been lost to history. Modern historians still rely heavily on materials that Boccaccio collected during his post-plague years. Perhaps most importantly, Boccaccio had demonstrated that literature could serve as historical documentation, that creative works could preserve authentic human experiences in ways that official chronicles often missed. His approach influenced generations of writers who understood that artistic expression could capture truths about historical events that purely factual accounts might overlook. The man who had begun as a minor court poet became, through his encounter with mass death, one of literature's most important voices. His transformation mirrors that of European society itself, which emerged from the plague years forever changed, but somehow stronger, more complex, and more aware of both human fragility and human resilience. Secrets buried in London's lost graveyards. Beneath the bustling streets of modern London lies one of archaeology's most haunting mysteries, a vast network of mass graves that holds secrets about the Black Death that written records could never preserve. These plague pits, discovered accidentally by construction workers and systematically excavated by forensic archaeologists, tell stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about medieval medicine, social structure, and humanity's response to catastrophic disease. The mystery began in 1987, when workers expanding London's underground rail system broke through into a forgotten medieval cemetery near Liverpool Street Station. What they found defied explanation, layer upon layer of human remains, stacked with geometric precision in enormous pits that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The bones told a story of mass death on an unimaginable scale, but they also revealed surprising details about how medieval Londoners had maintained their humanity even during civilization's darkest hour. Modern forensic archaeology has transformed our understanding of the Black Death by literally digging into the physical evidence that the plague left behind. These London excavations, along with similar discoveries across Europe, have created a new field of study called osteoarchaeology, where scientists analyze ancient bones to uncover secrets that no contemporary chronicler could have recorded. The East Smithfield Cemetery, discovered during the Liverpool Street excavations, represents the largest systematically studied plague burial ground in the world. Between 1348 and 1350, this single cemetery received an estimated 2,400 bodies, making it a time capsule of London's plague experience, frozen in soil and bone. But the mysteries hidden in these graves go far beyond simple body counts. The first puzzle that archaeologists encountered was the meticulous organization of the burials. Instead of the chaotic mass dumping that medieval chronicles described, the East Smithfield excavations revealed careful, respectful interment practices that suggested extraordinary efforts to maintain Christian burial traditions even during the plague's peak. Bodies were laid out in neat rows, properly oriented east to west according to Christian custom, with evidence of shrouds and occasional grave goods. This discovery challenged historical narratives that portrayed the plague years as a complete breakdown of social order. The archaeological evidence suggested that medieval Londoners had somehow maintained their cultural values and religious practices even while burying hundreds of people per day. The question that haunts researchers is, how did they manage such organization during history's greatest crisis? DNA analysis of teeth from these plague victims has revealed another layer of mystery. Scientists can now extract genetic material from Yersinia pestis, bacteria that died with their hosts over 650 years ago, creating the first direct evidence of the plague's genetic structure during the medieval pandemic. This ancient DNA has produced shocking revelations about the plague's evolution and spread patterns. The genetic evidence shows that the medieval plague strain was far more virulent than modern bubonic plague, containing genetic markers that made it deadlier and more transmissible than any plague variant seen in recent centuries. But even more mysteriously, the DNA reveals multiple distinct strains circulating simultaneously through medieval London, suggesting that the city was hit by several different plague outbreaks overlapping in time. This genetic diversity implies that London received infected ships and trade goods from multiple sources across the known world, turning the city into a mixing ground where different plague variants combined and potentially evolved into new, more dangerous forms. The implications are staggering. Medieval London may have been ground zero for plague evolution, a biological laboratory where different bacterial strains competed and merged in ways that shaped the pandemic's global impact. Isotope analysis of the victims' teeth and bones has revealed another fascinating mystery about medieval mobility and trade networks. By analyzing the chemical signatures left by different water sources and food types, scientists can determine where plague victims spent their childhood years. The results show that medieval London contained far more international residents than previously suspected. Many plague victims buried in East Smithfield had isotope signatures indicating they grew up in Scandinavia, northern France, the Low Countries, or even more distant regions. This suggests that London's pre-plague population included significant numbers of foreign merchants, craftsmen, and laborers who had emigrated to take advantage of the city's economic opportunities. The plague didn't just kill Londoners. It devastated an international community that had gathered from across medieval Europe. The mystery deepens when archaeologists examine the demographic patterns of plague mortality. Contrary to expectations, the plague pits don't show the random distribution of victims that infectious disease typically produces. Instead, there are curious gaps in certain age, groups, and social classes that suggest the plague's impact was more complex than simple bacterial infection. Children under 5 are dramatically underrepresented in the plague burials, not because they survived at higher rates, but because they seem to have been buried elsewhere, possibly in family plots or church graveyards that maintained separate burial practices for infants. This pattern suggests that even during the plague's peak, families made extraordinary efforts to ensure proper burial for their youngest members. Conversely, young adults between the ages of 15 and 30 are overrepresented in the plague pits, far beyond what random mortality would predict. This demographic skew implies that young adults were either more susceptible to plague infection or more likely to be buried in mass graves rather than individual plots. The mystery is understanding why this age group suffered disproportionately. One theory suggests that young adults were more exposed to infection because they remained economically active during the plague, continuing to work as merchants, craftsmen, and laborers, while older residents retreated into isolation. Another possibility is that young adults had less developed immunity from previous disease exposure, making them more vulnerable when the plague arrived. The archaeological evidence also reveals sophisticated medieval understanding of disease transmission that contradicts historical assumptions about medical ignorance. The East Smithfield burials show clear evidence of quicklime application, a practice that would have helped prevent secondary infections and reduced odors from decomposing bodies. This suggests that medieval authorities understood at least some principles of public health, even if they didn't grasp the bacterial nature of plague transmission. More mysteriously, some plague burials show evidence of deliberate attempts to prevent the spread of infection through supernatural means. Archaeologists have discovered bodies buried with iron nails driven through their hands and feet, medieval amulets placed in their mouths, an unusual positioning that suggests efforts to prevent the dead from rising as revenants or spreading disease beyond the grave. These practices reveal a fascinating intersection between practical, public health measures and supernatural beliefs about disease causation. Medieval Londoners simultaneously applied rational solutions like quicklime and mystical protections like iron nails, suggesting a complex worldview that tried to address both natural and supernatural aspects of the plague crisis. The chemical analysis of plague victims' bones has revealed surprising information about medieval diet and health during the crisis years. Many victims show evidence of improved nutrition in the months before their death, with higher levels of protein and trace minerals than would be expected during a period of social collapse. This nutritional improvement likely resulted from the economic disruption caused by massive mortality. With London's population declining rapidly, surviving residents had access to better food, supplies, and higher quality provisions than they had enjoyed before the plague. The cruel irony is that many people ate better during the plague years than they had during normal times, only to die from disease rather than malnutrition. The plague pits also contain evidence of medical treatments that don't appear in any written sources from the period. Some victims show bone modifications that suggest surgical procedures, including trepanation, deliberate bone cutting that may have been attempts to release corrupted humors or evil spirits causing the disease. These surgical interventions, discovered only through archaeological investigation, reveal that medieval medical practitioners were willing to attempt desperate experimental treatments when conventional remedies failed. The bone evidence suggests a more active interventionist approach to plague treatment than the passive bloodletting and herbal remedies described in medieval medical texts. Perhaps the most haunting discovery in the plague pits is evidence of care and compassion that persisted even during humanity's darkest hour. Many victims show signs of extended nursing care, with healed bed sores and bone modifications that indicate they survived for weeks or months while bedridden with plague symptoms. This evidence contradicts chroniclers' accounts of families abandoning their sick relatives. Instead, it suggests that many plague victims received devoted care from family members or community volunteers who risked their own lives to tend the dying. The archaeological record preserves acts of courage and compassion that no written source bothered to document. The mystery of how medieval communities maintained such care networks during a catastrophic pandemic remains unsolved. The logistics of nursing hundreds of thousands of plague victims while maintaining food supplies, sanitation, and basic social order seem impossible given medieval technology and organizational capabilities. Yet the bones don't lie. They show evidence of systematic care, organized burial practices, and maintained social structures that somehow persisted through civilization's greatest crisis. The question that haunts archaeologists is understanding how medieval people accomplished feats of social organization that seem beyond human capability. Modern analysis of plague pit soil samples has revealed another layer of mystery about medieval urban environments. The soil contains exotic pollen, spice residues, and mineral deposits that indicate London's international trade networks continued functioning even during the plague's peak. This evidence suggests that while local social structures were collapsing, long-distance trade somehow persisted, bringing goods from across the known world into a city where half the population was dying. The contradiction between local chaos and continued international commerce presents a puzzle about medieval economic resilience that historians are still trying to solve. The plague pits of London represent more than just mass graves. They're archaeological libraries containing information about medieval life that no written source preserved. Each skeleton tells a story about individual experience during humanity's greatest catastrophe, while the overall pattern reveals social structures and cultural practices that surviving chroniclers never thought to document. These discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of both the Black Death and medieval society more broadly. They reveal a world more complex, more resilient, and more compassionate than the traditional historical narrative suggested. But they also raise new questions about how human communities respond to existential threats, questions that remain relevant as we face our own global challenges. Recent advances in archaeological technology have opened even more mysterious chapters in the plague pit investigations. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed that London's medieval plague burial network extends far beyond the known excavation sites, with potential mass graves scattered throughout the modern city. These hidden burial grounds may contain tens of thousands of additional plague victims, creating an underground map of medieval London's death toll that could rewrite population estimates. The most intriguing recent discovery involves evidence of deliberate body modification in some plague victims, suggesting ritual practices that have no parallel in known medieval Christian burial traditions. Several skeletons show careful post-mortem bone cutting around the skull and major joints, performed with surgical precision after death but before burial. The purpose of these modifications remains completely mysterious. Some archaeologists theorize these cuts were attempts to prevent the dead from rising as plagues spreading revenants, reflecting medieval fears that plague victims might return from death to infect the living. Others suggest the modifications had medical purposes, possibly attempts to study plague anatomy or to drain infected bodily fluids that were believed to cause continued contamination. The bone-cutting patterns show remarkable consistency across different burial sites, suggesting these practices were organized and systematic rather than random acts of desperation. Someone, whether medical practitioners or religious authorities, had developed standardized procedures for handling plague corpses that went far beyond anything described in contemporary medical or theological texts. Chemical analysis of the cut bone surfaces has revealed traces of substances not found elsewhere in the plague pits. These include exotic resins, possibly frankincense or myrrh, and metallic residues that might indicate the use of silver or copper implements in the cutting procedures. The presence of expensive imported materials suggests these ritual modifications were reserved for victims of higher social status, adding another layer to the mystery. The discovery of these practices has forced archaeologists to reconsider the relationship between medieval medicine and folk magic during crisis periods. The plague may have pushed medieval practitioners beyond the boundaries of accepted medical practice, leading them to experiment with procedures that combine surgical technique, religious ritual, and supernatural protection methods. Even more mysteriously, some plague pits contain evidence of bodies that were exhumed and reburied months or years after their initial interment. These secondary burials show signs of careful handling and preservation, suggesting that families or communities returned to retrieve specific individuals for reburial in consecrated ground once the immediate crisis had passed. The logistics of these reburials present fascinating puzzles about medieval record-keeping and community memory. How did survivors identify specific individuals among thousands of plague victims buried in mass graves? What motivated families to undertake the dangerous and expensive process of exhuming plague victims for proper reburial? Isotope analysis of the reburied remains shows they often came from higher social classes than the general plague pit population, suggesting that wealth and status influenced not just medical care during life, but also burial practices after death. Even during history's greatest crisis, social hierarchies found ways to assert themselves in death as they had in life. The plague pits have also yielded unexpected evidence about medieval London's animal populations during the crisis years. Mixed in with human remains, archaeologists have found the skeletons of dogs, cats, horses, and even exotic birds that appear to have died from plague infection. This evidence supports historical accounts of the plague affecting animal populations, but provides the first direct proof of cross-species transmission in medieval urban environments. The animal remains tell their own mysterious stories. Many show evidence of deliberate burial alongside human victims, suggesting that medieval Londoners maintained emotional attachments to their pets even during the plague crisis. Some animal skeletons were found wearing expensive collars or jewelry, indicating they belonged to wealthy households that could afford luxury items for their pets. More puzzling are the exotic bird remains found in several plague pits. These include species native to Africa and Asia that could only have reached London through long-distance trade networks. The presence of tropical birds in plague burials suggests that London's international connections remained active throughout the crisis, with merchants continuing to import luxury goods even as the city's population collapsed. The preservation of organic materials in London's clay soil has allowed archaeologists to recover textile fragments, leather goods, and wooden objects that provide unprecedented insights into medieval material culture during the plague years. These artifacts reveal that many plague victims were buried in expensive clothing and with valuable possessions, contradicting assumptions that crisis conditions led to the stripping of valuables from the dead. Some of the most intriguing textile discoveries include silk fabrics with weaving patterns that don't match any known European production techniques. These exotic textiles may have been imported from Central Asia, China, or the Middle East, providing direct physical evidence of the global trade networks that carried both luxury goods and plague bacteria across medieval Eurasia. The wooden artifacts present their own mysteries. Several plague burials contain elaborately carved wooden objects that appear to be medical instruments or ritual implements. The carvings include symbols and inscriptions in scripts that don't match standard medieval Latin writing, suggesting the presence of foreign medical practitioners or the use of non-Christian healing traditions during the plague crisis. Radiocarbon dating of these artifacts has produced some puzzling results, with several items showing dates that precede the Black Death by decades or even centuries. This suggests that some plague victims were buried with antique objects, possibly family heirlooms or sacred items thought to provide protection in the afterlife. The presence of pre-plague artifacts in plague burials raises questions about how medieval families maintained cultural traditions and material connections to their past during periods of extreme crisis. Even while facing extinction, some communities made efforts to preserve their heritage through burial practices that honored both the dead and their ancestral connections. Modern environmental analysis of plague pit soil has revealed traces of medicinal plants that don't appear in any surviving medieval herbal guides. Pollen analysis indicates the presence of exotic healing herbs that must have been imported from distant regions, suggesting that plague treatment involved pharmaceutical knowledge that transcended local medical traditions. Some of the identified plant species are known to have antibacterial properties, indicating that medieval healers may have stumbled upon genuinely effective treatments through trial and error experimentation. The irony is that some plague victims may have received better medical care than previously assumed, only to die from bacterial strains too virulent for any medieval treatment to overcome. The chemical signatures of these medicinal plants suggest they came from multiple geographic regions, implying that London's plague response involved collaboration between medical practitioners from different cultural backgrounds. This international medical cooperation during the crisis provides yet another example of how the plague both destroyed and created connections between distant communities. Perhaps the most haunting discovery in recent plague pit excavations involves evidence of attempted resurrection rituals. Several burials show signs that bodies were partially exhumed shortly after burial, with specific organs removed and replaced with plant materials or mineral substances. These modifications appear to represent desperate attempts to restore life to plague victims through procedures that combined medieval medical theory with magical practices. The resurrection attempts show remarkable anatomical knowledge, with precise removal of hearts, livers, and brains that suggests skilled surgical technique. The replacement materials include herbs associated with life restoration in medieval magical texts, along with precious stones and metals thought to possess healing properties. These discoveries force us to confront the possibility that medieval responses to the plague included practices that historical sources were too embarrassed or frightened to record. The archaeological evidence suggests a hidden world of experimental medicine and magical intervention that operated alongside official medical and religious responses to the crisis. The mysteries buried in London's plague pits remind us that the past still holds secrets waiting to be discovered. Every archaeological excavation has the potential to overturn centuries of historical assumption, revealing truths about human experience that only the dead can tell. As new technologies allow deeper analysis of these ancient remains, we continue to uncover evidence of medieval resilience, ingenuity, and desperation that no written chronicle could have preserved. When death knocked on heaven's door, while common people died in streets and plague pits across Europe, there existed another world entirely, one of marble halls and golden chalices, where the most powerful man in medieval Christendom tried desperately to protect himself from God's own wrath. This is the story of Pope Clement VI and the papal court at Avignon during the Black Death, a tale of ultimate privilege confronted by humanity's greatest equalizer. The papal palace at Avignon in 1348 represented the pinnacle of medieval luxury and power. Built on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Rhine River in southern France, the palace complex sprawled across multiple acres, its Gothic spires and fortified walls creating what contemporaries called the most beautiful and strongest house in the world. Here, surrounded by the finest art, the richest foods, and the most learned scholars in Europe, Pope Clement VI ruled over Western Christianity from what his critics called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Clement VI, born Pierre Roger, was no typical medieval pope. Before his election in 1342, he had served as a Benedictine monk, a university professor, and a diplomatic advisor to the French crown. He was brilliant, cultured, and worldly, a man who appreciated fine wine, beautiful manuscripts, and sophisticated theological debate. He had transformed the Avignon papacy into a center of learning and artistic patronage that rivaled the greatest courts of Europe. But in October 1347, as reports of a terrible pestilence began reaching Avignon from Italian ports, even the Holy Father found himself confronting a crisis that challenged the very foundations of his authority. If God ruled the universe and the Pope served as his representative on earth, how could the Vicar of Christ explain a plague that was killing Christians and pagans with equal ferocity? The papal palace's daily routine in 1348 provided a stark contrast to the chaos engulfing the outside world. While plague victims writhed in agony in the streets of Avignon's lower town, the Pope's morning began with private prayers in his lavishly decorated chapel, its walls covered with frescoes depicting biblical scenes of divine mercy and protection. After prayers, Clement would break his fast with delicacies prepared by master chefs using ingredients imported from across the known world. The papal kitchen represented a marvel of medieval culinary sophistication. Even during the plague years, ships continued arriving from distant ports carrying exotic spices, fine wines, and luxury foods reserved for the papal table. Peacocks stuffed with rare herbs, wines aged in monastery cellars, and sweetmeats crafted by master confectioners provided the Pope with meals that most Europeans couldn't imagine, let alone afford. Yet even in this privileged sanctuary, the plague's presence made itself known in subtle but unmistakable ways. The number of servants attending papal meals had quietly decreased as kitchen staff succumbed to the pestilence. The usual crowds of petitioners seeking papal audiences had dwindled to a handful of desperate souls begging for divine intervention. Most tellingly, the constant stream of messengers bringing news from across Christendom now carried reports that grew darker and more devastating with each passing week. Clement's response to the plague crisis revealed both the strengths and limitations of medieval papal power. Unlike many religious leaders who fled their posts during the pestilence, the Pope remained in Avignon, maintaining the appearance of divine confidence while privately grappling with theological questions that threatened to undermine centuries of Christian doctrine. The papal court's physicians, the finest medical minds available in medieval Europe, had constructed elaborate theories to explain the plague's arrival. They blamed the pestilence on a conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn that had occurred in 1345, an astrological alignment that had supposedly corrupted the very air that people breathed. Others suggested that underground earthquakes had released poisonous vapors from the Earth's core, creating the miasma that carried death across the continent. These learned explanations satisfied no one, least of all the Pope himself. In private correspondence that survived the medieval period, Clement revealed his growing desperation as traditional explanations proved inadequate to address the scale of the catastrophe. He worried that the plague might represent the beginning of the end times prophesied in the book of Revelation, making him the last pope to preside over Christianity before Christ's return to judge the living and the dead. The papal palace's isolation from the common people's suffering created its own moral crisis. While Clement dined on delicacies and slept in silk sheets, his spiritual children died by the millions without access to basic medical care or even proper burial rites. The contradiction between papal luxury and Christian charity became increasingly difficult to rationalize as the death toll mounted. Clement's solution was characteristically medieval in its combination of practical politics and theological innovation. He issued a series of papal bulls, official documents that attempted to address both the spiritual and practical challenges posed by the plague. The most famous of these, Quenvie's Paphigian, granted remission of sins to anyone who died of the plague, effectively guaranteeing heaven to plague victims without requiring the usual sacramental procedures. This theological innovation represented a radical departure from traditional Catholic doctrine. which insisted that salvation required proper confession, penance, and last rites administered by ordained clergy. By granting automatic salvation to plague victims, Clement acknowledged that the normal mechanisms of salvation had broken down under the weight of mass death. The Pope also addressed practical problems created by the massive clerical mortality, with priests dying as rapidly as their parishioners. Many plague victims faced death without access to the sacraments that medieval Christianity considered essential for salvation. Clement issued emergency dispensations, allowing deacons and even lay people to hear confessions and administer last rites, temporarily suspending centuries of church law to meet the crisis. But perhaps Clement's most controversial decision involved his response to the violence that the plague had unleashed against Jewish communities across Europe. As the pestilence spread, desperate Christian populations had begun blaming Jews for causing the plague through well poisoning, ritual murder, or other supposed conspiracies. Pogroms erupted from Spain to Germany, with entire Jewish communities burned alive by mobs seeking scapegoats for their suffering. In September 1348, Clement issued the bull Sicut Judaeus, which condemned the persecution of Jews and pointed out that the plague was killing Jews at the same rate as Christians, making Jewish conspiracy theories obviously false. The Pope threatened excommunication for anyone participating in anti-Jewish violence. One of the few times in medieval history that papal authority was used to protect rather than persecute Jewish communities. This protection came at considerable political cost. Many of Clement's supporters, including powerful nobles and church officials, had either participated in or endorsed the anti-Jewish violence. By defending Jewish communities, the Pope risked alienating Christian populations who desperately needed someone to blame for their suffering. The daily life of the papal court during the plague years reflected these tensions between spiritual leadership and political survival. Clement continued hosting elaborate ceremonial functions, partly to maintain the appearance of divine confidence and partly because cancelling religious observances would have suggested that the plague was beyond God's control. The papal chapel services during the plague became exercises in theological tightrope walking. Clement had to acknowledge the suffering of his spiritual children, while maintaining that God remained benevolent and in control of earthly events. His sermons from this period, preserved in papal archives, show a brilliant theologian struggling to explain inexplicable suffering while preserving both divine justice and human hope. The Pope's private life during the plague reveals a man caught between his public role as Christ's representative and his personal fears as a mortal human being. Clement had grown up during a period of papal power and prestige, when the Church seemed destined to dominate European politics and culture indefinitely. The plague forced him to confront the possibility that Christianity itself might not survive history's greatest catastrophe. Contemporary accounts describe the Pope spending hours in private prayer, consulting not just traditional theological sources but also astrological charts, medical treatises, and even folk remedies in desperate searches for understanding. He corresponded extensively with scholars across Europe, creating what amounted to an international research network focused on explaining and combating the pestilence. The papal court's response to the plague also revealed the international character of medieval Christendom, even as political borders became meaningless in the face of pandemic disease. Religious connections continued functioning across vast distances. Clement received reports from bishops in England, abbots in Germany, and missionaries in Eastern Europe, creating a communication network that provided the most comprehensive contemporary account of the plague's European impact. These reports painted a picture of devastation that challenged every assumption about divine providence and human destiny. Monasteries that had preserved classical learning for centuries were emptying as monks died faster than they could be replaced. Universities closed as both students and professors succumbed to the pestilence. Entire dioceses found themselves without bishops, leaving local churches to function without higher supervision for the first time in centuries. The economic impact of the plague on the papal court illustrated how interconnected medieval European society had become. The papacy's vast wealth depended on tithes, donations, and fees collected from across Christendom. As the plague decimated Europe's population, these revenue streams dried up rapidly, forcing even the richest institution in medieval Europe to confront financial crises. Clement's financial records from the plague years show dramatic reductions in papal income, not just because fewer people were alive to pay church taxes, but because survivors had more pressing concerns than supporting papal luxury. The result was a forced simplicity that brought the papal court closer to the apostolic poverty that reformers had demanded for centuries. The Pope's personal health became a constant concern as the plague raged around Avignon. Medieval medicine offered little protection even for the wealthy and powerful, leaving Clement dependent on the same ineffective treatments available to common people. His physicians prescribed bloodletting, herbal remedies, and astrological timing for medical procedures, treatments that were useless against bacterial infection regardless of the patient's social status. Clement's survival probably depended more on luck in isolation than on medical intervention. The papal palace's location on a rocky outcrop provided some natural protection from the rat populations that carried infected fleas, while the court's access to clean water and relatively good sanitation offered additional advantages over urban populations living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. But even papal privilege couldn't completely isolate Clement from the plague's psychological impact. Contemporary descriptions of the Pope during the plague years show a man aged beyond his years, his hair gone completely white and his face marked by lines of worry that hadn't existed before. 1347. The responsibility of providing spiritual leadership during humanity's greatest crisis had exacted a toll that no amount of papal luxury could alleviate. The plague also forced fundamental changes in papal administration and church governance. With so many clergy dead, Clement had to rapidly ordain new priests, often relaxing educational and moral requirements that had previously been strictly enforced. The result was a generation of hastily trained clergy who lacked the theological sophistication of their predecessors, but possessed the courage to minister to plague victims despite mortal danger. These emergency ordinations created lasting changes in church culture. The new clergy, drawn from lower social classes and given minimal training, brought different perspectives to church leadership. They were more likely to emphasize practical charity over theological speculation, more willing to adapt church law to local needs, and more sympathetic to the struggles of common people. Clement's diplomatic correspondence during the plague reveals his awareness that the pestilence was reshaping the political map of Europe. Traditional alliances became meaningless when entire royal courts died within weeks. Trade networks that had connected distant regions for centuries collapsed as merchant families succumbed to the plague. The careful balance of power that had characterized medieval European politics dissolved in the face of demographic catastrophe. The Pope found himself dealing with unprecedented situations that had no precedent in church law or political theory. What happened when entire kingdoms lost their ruling families? How should church property be redistributed when entire monasteries died out? Who had authority to collect taxes or enforce laws when traditional government structures had collapsed? Clement's solutions to these problems often involved creative interpretations of existing church doctrine, establishing precedents that would influence papal policy for centuries to come. His willingness to adapt church law to emergency conditions set important precedents for papal flexibility during future crises. The transformation of religious art and architecture during Clement's reign reflected the plague's psychological impact on medieval culture. The Pope commissioned works that increasingly emphasized mortality, judgment, and the afterlife, moving away from the triumphant, worldly themes that had characterized pre-plague papal patronage. The most famous artistic commission from this period was a series of frescoes depicting the Dance of Death, showing skeletons leading people from all social classes, including popes and kings, to their graves. These images, painted in the papal palace itself, represented a revolutionary acknowledgement that even the highest religious authority remained subject to mortality and divine judgment. As the plague gradually burned itself out across Europe in 1351, Clement found himself presiding over a fundamentally changed world. The Church's political power had diminished as secular authorities gained strength from the demographic disruption. The papacy's moral authority had been challenged by its inability to provide effective protection from the pestilence. Most importantly, the plague had created a generation of survivors who had witnessed the apparent randomness of divine justice and emerged with different expectations of religious leadership. Clement VI died in 1352, just a year after the plague's end, possibly from complications related to the stress and exhaustion of governing the Church through its greatest crisis. His death marked the end of an era in papal history, closing the chapter on a papacy that had tried to maintain medieval Christianity's worldly ambitions while confronting a catastrophe that revealed the ultimate insignificance of earthly power. The legacy of Clement's plague response influenced church policy for generations. His theological innovations regarding salvation and sacramental requirements became permanent features of Catholic doctrine. His defense of Jewish communities established precedents for papal protection of religious minorities. His administrative reforms created more flexible, responsive church governance structures that proved essential for managing future crises. But perhaps Clement's most important legacy was his demonstration that even ultimate earthly authority remained powerless in the face of natural catastrophe. The plague had humbled popes and peasants equally, revealing that human institutions, regardless of their divine pretensions, remained vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The papal household during the plague years included some of medieval Europe's most fascinating characters, each grappling with the catastrophe in their own unique ways. Cardinal Guy de Boulogne, Clement's closest advisor, had initially dismissed the plague as a temporary crisis that would strengthen the Church's authority by demonstrating God's power over earthly affairs. By 1349, however, his correspondence reveals a man shattered by the realization that the pestilence was destroying the very foundations of medieval Christendom. The papal librarian, a scholarly monk named Brother Thomas of Strasbourg, became obsessed with collecting and preserving manuscripts as monasteries across Europe emptied. He organized expeditions to abandoned religious houses, retrieving priceless texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. His efforts saved thousands of classical and medieval works, but the psychological cost was enormous. Thomas's personal journal, discovered in the 19th century, records his growing despair as he witnessed the destruction of intellectual traditions that had taken centuries to develop. The papal treasurer, Cardinal Bertrand of Montferrat, faced the impossible task of maintaining church finances as income plummeted and expenses soared. His detailed financial records reveal that the papacy spent enormous sums attempting to provide relief to plague-stricken communities, often bankrupting local papal representatives in desperate attempts to provide food, medicine, and burial services to devastated populations. These expenditures created a curious paradox. While critics accused the papacy of worldly luxury, Clement's administration actually impoverished itself, trying to address the plague crisis. By 1350, the papal court had sold off significant portions of its art collection and precious metalwork to fund relief efforts, transforming the opulent Avignon palace into a more modest, functional administrative center. The papal court's international connections provided unique insights into how different cultures responded to the plague crisis. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals fascinating variations in plague responses across medieval Europe. Spanish kingdoms implemented aggressive quarantine measures that may have reduced mortality rates. German cities developed sophisticated systems for caring for plague orphans. Italian city-states pioneered new forms of public health administration that would influence urban planning for centuries. But perhaps the most intriguing papal correspondent was a mysterious figure known only as the physician of Avignon, who sent detailed medical observations to the Pope throughout the plague years. These letters, written in a mixture of Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew, suggest their author was a Jewish or Muslim medical practitioner working within the Christian papal administration. The physician's letters describe experimental treatments that don't appear in any other medieval medical sources. He wrote about using quarantine procedures learned from Islamic medical texts, applying surgical techniques developed by Jewish physicians in Spain, and testing herbal remedies derived from ancient Greek medical traditions. His multicultural approach to medicine contrasted sharply with the rigid Christian orthodoxy that usually dominated papal thinking. Even more remarkably, the physician's letters include accurate descriptions of plague transmission mechanisms that wouldn't be officially recognized by European medicine for another 5 centuries. He correctly identified rats and fleas as disease vectors, understood the relationship between sanitation and infection rates, and recommended preventive measures that actually worked. The presence of this advanced medical knowledge within the papal court raises fascinating questions about medieval Europe's intellectual isolation. While official church doctrine discouraged learning from non-Christian sources, the plague crisis apparently created opportunities for cross-cultural medical collaboration that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The papal court's response to the plague also revealed deep tensions within medieval Christianity about the relationship between earthly power and spiritual authority. Many reform-minded clergy saw the plague as divine punishment for the papacy's worldly ambitions, arguing that Christ's representatives should live in apostolic poverty rather than princely luxury. These criticisms gained momentum as the plague progressed and papal wealth became increasingly difficult to justify in the face of mass suffering. Reform movements that had simmered quietly for decades suddenly gained popular support, creating internal church conflicts that would eventually contribute to the Great Western Schism and the Protestant Reformation. Clement's private correspondence from his final years reveals a man haunted by the possibility that his critics were correct. He wrote extensively about his desire to reform church practices, reduce papal wealth, and return to simpler forms of Christian worship. However, the practical demands of governing a global institution during history's greatest crisis made such reforms nearly impossible to implement. The Pope's personal spiritual crisis deepened as reports arrived describing the emergence of radical religious movements across plague-stricken Europe. Flagellant groups had taken over entire towns, preaching that traditional church hierarchy was unnecessary for salvation. Heretical sects proclaimed that the plague proved God's abandonment of institutional Christianity. Some communities had begun practicing forms of Christianity that bore little resemblance to official Catholic doctrine. These developments terrified church authorities because they suggested that the plague might permanently fracture Christian unity. Clement spent his final years developing theological responses to heretical movements, trying to demonstrate that papal authority remained relevant even in a post-plague world. The papal court's daily routines during the plague's final phases reflected this growing uncertainty about the Church's future. Traditional ceremonial functions continued, but with reduced attendance and modified rituals that acknowledged the changed circumstances. The Pope's public appearances became less frequent and more heavily guarded, partly due to security concerns, but mostly because of Clement's declining health and confidence. The papal kitchen, once famous for elaborate banquets, adopted simpler menus that reflected both reduced income and changed moral priorities. The Pope's personal servants were instructed to distribute leftover food to plague refugees rather than disposing of it, a small gesture that reflected Clement's growing awareness of his moral responsibilities during the crisis. Even the papal court's artistic patronage shifted toward more somber, introspective themes. The magnificent frescoes that had celebrated papal power and worldly success were supplemented by new works emphasizing mortality, judgment, and spiritual preparation for death. These artistic changes reflected not just personal preference, but strategic recognition that post-plague, Christianity would need to address different spiritual needs than its predecessor. The papal court at Avignon during the Black Death represents a fascinating case study in how elite communities respond to existential threats. Unlike the common people who faced the plague with few resources and little protection, Clement and his court had access to the best medical care, the finest living conditions, and the most sophisticated intellectual frameworks available in medieval Europe. Yet none of these advantages provided meaningful protection from bacterial infection or effective solutions to the theological and political crises that the plague created. Ultimately, the plague revealed that medieval Christianity's greatest strength, its claim to universal authority over human affairs, was also its greatest vulnerability when faced with forces beyond human control. The papal response to the Black Death demonstrated both the remarkable adaptability of human institutions and their ultimate powerlessness in the face of natural catastrophe. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed. Unlike the people we just learned about, sleep well